By first light in 1923 somewhere in Wyoming, the work crews along the temporary spur past milepost 40 watched a malamute trot into the gap between snow berms and never come out the other side. His name was Kodiak. He belonged to the foreman, a man named Leland Farr who had worked that grade for 6 seasons and knew the sound of every coupling, every brake shoe, every frozen timber that cracked under weight before dawn. Kodiak ran the line every morning, back and forth between the cook car and the tool shed, quiet as a shadow, steady as clockwork. On a windless morning in late February, men watched him lope into that 30-yard gap, and he simply never emerged on the far side. No fresh prints crossed the drift beyond the cut, and the packed snow under the trestle carried nothing but boot-heel dents from the crew's inspection the day before. That night, a lantern was seen moving beneath the deck where no man could stand. And when dawn broke again, Kodiak's collar turned up warm on iron rail that had been left out in air cold enough to crack sap. After that week, nobody in Wyoming walked that stretch alone. Not then. Not now. The spur sat at the edge of open scrubland just below the Medicine Bow Range, where Union Pacific had set down portable track to haul timbers for a trestle repair upline. It was a hard winter that year, the kind that settles into your bones and stays there even after you've come inside. The wind came down off the granite ridges without mercy, steady and low, and the cold was the sort that made your teeth ache if you opened your mouth too wide. Men worked in layers, wool under canvas under oilcloth, and still the cold found a way through. The snow had piled in long berms on either side of the cut, shoulder high in places, packed tight enough to walk on. Between those berms ran the spur, maybe 30 yards of open track, and at the far end the trestle deck sat low over a shallow ravine where nothing grew but juniper and sage, twisted and gray under the snow. The sky that morning was pale and still, no clouds, no wind, just the kind of silence that makes a man aware of his own breathing. Coal smoke from the work engine hung in the air without moving, and the smell of it mixed with the sharp bite of frozen iron and the faint sweetness of sap bleeding slow from stacked timber. Leland Farr was 42 years old, a widower who slept in the crew bunk car and ate his meals standing up at the end of the plank table. He had brought Kodiak as a pup from a rail camp outside Missoula 7 years before, and the dog had worked alongside him ever since, carrying gloves in his mouth when Farr forgot them on the grade, sitting quiet during morning roll call with his tail tucked under, sleeping across Farr's boots on nights when the stove went cold and the frost crept in through the seams of the bunk car. Farr's daughter, Margaret, lived in Cheyenne with her husband and 2 young sons. She sent letters twice a month, written in careful script on thin paper that smelled faintly of lavender. Farr saved them in a tin box under his bunk and read them on Sundays when the crew took half a day. The men said he was the kind you could trust to work alone, the kind who didn't need watching, the kind who kept his word even when it cost him. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. When Kodiak didn't come back through the cut that morning, Farr stood up slow from the tool shed steps, set down the gauge wrench he'd been holding, and walked the 30 yards himself without saying a word to anyone. He called the dog's name once, then twice. His voice carried flat across the snow and died without an echo. Then he stopped calling and just stood there in the center of the cut, looking at the snow under his boots. The footprints, Kodiak's prints, went into the gap clear and deep, 4 clean paw marks repeating in a steady trot, the pattern unmistakable. Farr had walked behind that dog for 7 years. He knew the gait, knew the spacing, knew the way the rear paws landed just inside the line of the front. Halfway through the cut, the prints stopped, not faded, not drifted over, not covered by wind. Just gone. The snow beyond that point sat smooth and unbroken all the way to the far berm, and when Farr walked the whole stretch twice, turning in a slow circle at the end, he found nothing. The packed drift under the trestle carried nothing but boot dents from the crew's inspection the day before, shallow divots in the frozen crust already old. Farr stood there for a long time, his breath clouding in front of his face, his hands hanging loose at his sides. He walked back to the spot where the prints ended and knelt in the snow. One of the younger men, a tie setter from Laramie named Herschel Vance, came up beside him with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. "You want me to fetch the others?" Vance asked. Farr didn't answer right away. He was staring at something in the snow just past the cutoff point, maybe 6 feet beyond the last clear print. It was Kodiak's collar, leather and brass, the buckle still fastened, laid flat across the iron rail as though someone had set it there with care. Farr reached for it, then pulled his hand back fast the moment his fingers brushed the leather. "Still warm," he said, and his voice came out strange and tight. Vance stared at the collar, then at Farr, then back at the collar. The air between them felt suddenly heavier, as though something had shifted without moving. Vance knelt down beside Farr and held his own hand near the collar without touching it. He could feel the heat coming off the leather even from 6 inches away. The rail beneath it was cold enough to burn skin on contact. Vance stood up fast and took 2 steps back. He didn't reach for the collar. Nobody else touched it barehanded after that. By noon, every man on the crew had walked the cut at least once. Some of them brought tools, shovels, pry bars, anything with a long handle, and used them to prod at the snow berms on either side, thinking maybe the dog had bolted sideways and burrowed in. They found nothing. A few of them climbed up onto the berms themselves and looked down into the scrubland beyond, scanning for movement, for tracks, for anything that didn't belong. The land stretched away flat and white and empty, broken only by clumps of sage and the dark line of a dry creek bed maybe a quarter-mile out. One man swore he saw a shadow moving along that creek bed, low to the ground. But when 2 others went out to check, they found nothing. No prints, no disturbance, not even a broken twig. The older hands on the crew, men who had worked grade all over Montana and Wyoming and knew what cold could do to a man's mind, started saying things under their breath that the younger men didn't quite catch. Things about the land past milepost 40. Things about crews that had worked that stretch before and left without finishing the job. Things about sounds heard under the trestle in winters past. Sounds that didn't belong to wind or animals or anything a man could name. Nobody wanted to repeat those things in full daylight, but they passed from man to man in half-finished sentences and long silences. That night, long after the lamps in the bunk car had been snuffed and the men had settled into their blankets, 2 of them, Vance and another man named Pruitt, walked out to the privy that sat 30 yards downgrade from the cook car. It was past midnight, cold enough that the stars looked hard and brittle overhead. On their way back, they stopped. There was a light moving under the trestle deck, low and steady, swinging side to side like someone carrying a lantern bent double. It moved slow, deliberate, never lifting, never going dark. Vance called out. His voice cracked in the cold. The light kept moving. Pruitt picked up a fist-sized rock from the grade and threw it hard in the direction of the light. They heard it hit wood, heard it rattle down through the juniper, but the light didn't falter. It kept swinging back and forth, and then it stopped. Just stopped mid-swing and went dark all at once. Vance climbed down into the ravine with a hand lamp, his breath coming fast and shallow, and Pruitt stayed at the top with another rock in his hand ready to throw. The space under the deck was too low for a man to stand, maybe 4 feet at the center beam, less at the edges where the supports angled down into the dirt. The juniper grew thick there, twisted and dense, and Vance had to crouch and push his way through, holding the lamp out in front of him. The branches scraped at his coat and caught on his sleeves, and the cold down there felt different somehow, heavier, like it was pressing in from all sides. He found nothing. No tracks in the frozen dirt. No sign anyone had been there at all. The ground under the trestle was packed hard, smooth as iron, and the juniper branches nearest the grade showed no breaks, no bent stems, nothing to suggest anything larger than a rabbit had passed through in weeks. He swept the lamp in slow arcs, checking every shadow, every gap between the twisted trunks. Nothing. When he climbed back up, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the lamp, and his face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Pruitt asked him what he saw. Vance shook his head and wouldn't answer. They walked back to the bunk car in silence, and neither of them told anyone else until 2 days later, and by then it didn't matter because other men had seen the light too, and nobody wanted to talk about it anymore. The last time anyone had seen Kodiak moving on his own was at 5:47 that morning, when the cook car lantern was still lit, and the sky held only the faintest gray line above the eastern ridges. A rail hand named Otis Kern had been standing by the tool shed door, rolling a cigarette, when he watched the dog trot past him heading toward the cut. Kern remembered the time because he had just checked his pocket watch against the work engine's clock. making sure he hadn't overslept his shift. He watched Kodiak reach the mouth of the cut, saw him drop his head once as though sniffing at something in the snow, then saw him lope forward into the gap between the berms. Kern looked down to light his cigarette, cupping his hands around the match to keep the wind from snuffing it. When he looked up again, maybe 5 seconds later, maybe 10, the dog was gone. Kern assumed he had passed through to the far side and thought nothing more of it until Farr came walking back through the cut alone 20 minutes later, calling the dog's name in a voice that made every man on the grade stop what he was doing and listen. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, 17 men had gathered near the cut, standing in loose clusters, stamping their feet against the cold. Farr stood apart from them, near the spot where the prints ended, staring at the collar he had wrapped in a clean rag and placed inside his coat pocket. One of the older hands, a track supervisor named Glendon Rye, who had worked Union Pacific grade since before the turn of the century, walked the cut 3 times in silence, then came back and stood beside Farr without saying a word for a long time. Finally, Rye spoke. "I worked a spur near Rawlins in '09, he said. "Similar country, similar setup. We lost a mule one morning, same kind of thing. Walked into a cut and didn't come out. We tore that ground apart for a week and never found a trace." Farr didn't look at him. "What did you do?" Farr asked. Rye looked out toward the trestle, his breath clouding in the cold air. "We moved the grade," he said. Farr was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We can't move this one." Rye nodded slowly. "I know," he said. They started the search in earnest just after 8, when the light was strong enough to see tracks clearly. The crew divided into 3 groups. The first group walked the cut itself shoulder to shoulder, inspecting every inch of snow between the berms. They moved slowly, methodically, checking for depressions, for shadows, for anything that looked out of place. The second group climbed onto the berms and looked down into the scrubland on either side, scanning for prints, for disturbance, for anything that suggested the dog had bolted sideways and somehow escaped notice. The third group went under the trestle, crawling through the juniper with hand lamps and lengths of rope tied around their waists so they could be pulled back if the ground gave way. They worked for hours, moving in careful patterns, calling to each other to mark progress. They found nothing. The snow in the cut showed only Kodiak's prints going in, stopping halfway, and nothing more. The scrubland on either side lay smooth and undisturbed, broken only by wind-carved drifts and the occasional dark shape of a sage clump poking through. The ground under the trestle was frozen solid, packed smooth, and empty. By midday, someone suggested checking the ravine itself, thinking maybe the dog had somehow fallen through a gap in the deck. 2 men climbed down with ropes and lanterns and walked the bottom of the ravine from end to end, probing the snow with long poles, checking under every overhang, every clump of juniper thick enough to hide something the size of a dog. They found nothing. One of them, a man named Calhoun, stopped halfway through the ravine and called up to the others. "There's a smell down here," he said. The men above asked what kind of smell. Calhoun didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice sounded strange, tight in his throat. "Like metal," he said. "Like hot iron. But there's nothing burning." They pulled him up and sent someone else down, a younger man named Dietz who had worked in a foundry before coming to the railroad. Dietz walked the same stretch Calhoun had walked, breathing deep, checking every shadow. When he came back up, he shook his head. "Didn't smell anything," he said. Calhoun stood at the edge of the grade, staring down into the ravine, his face pale. He wouldn't go back down after that, and nobody pushed him. That afternoon, they brought in 2 dogs from a homestead 5 miles south, cattle dogs, used to working open country. The dogs picked up Kodiak's scent at the tool shed and followed it straight to the cut, pulling hard on their leads, tails high, every line of their bodies focused and intent. The man holding the leads had to brace his weight to keep from being dragged forward. Halfway through the cut, at the exact spot where Kodiak's prints ended, both dogs stopped. They dropped to their bellies in the snow, whining low in their throats, and refused to move forward. The man holding the leads pulled hard, then harder, digging his heels into the packed snow. The dogs wouldn't budge. One of them started to shake, a full-body tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. The other one turned in a circle twice, lay down again, and started to howl, a long, rising sound that made every man on the grade stop and turn toward the cut. The sound went on for maybe 10 seconds, climbing higher, then broke off suddenly as though the dog had been struck. They pulled the dogs back and took them away. The homesteader who had brought them said later that both dogs refused to eat for 2 days after, and one of them never worked cattle again. Nobody tried to bring dogs in again after that. By evening, the search had expanded outward in all directions, covering a half-mile radius from the cut. Men walked in lines across the scrubland, calling Kodiak's name, checking every hollow, every drift, every shadow that might hide a body. They marked their paths with strips of rag tied to sage branches so they wouldn't cover the same ground twice. The wind had started to pick up, coming down cold off the ridges, and the light was beginning to fail. They found nothing. As the sun dropped below the Medicine Bow Range and the shadows stretched long across the snow, Farr walked the cut one more time, alone, moving slowly from one end to the other. He stopped at the spot where the collar had been and knelt in the snow, pressing his bare hand into the surface as though testing for warmth. One of the men watching him, a younger hand named Pruitt, said later that Farr stayed there for a long time, not moving, not speaking, just kneeling in the snow with his head bowed like a man at prayer. When he finally stood up, he walked back to the bunk car without looking at anyone, and when someone tried to speak to him, he just shook his head and kept walking. That night, 3 men saw the light under the trestle again. This time it appeared just after 10, moving in the same slow arc as before, low and steady, swinging side to side as though someone were walking bent double beneath the deck. One of them was Vance, who had seen it the night before. He stood at the edge of the grade with 2 others, Mackie and a man named Ehrlich, and watched the light move for maybe 30 seconds before it went dark. The 3 of them stood there in the cold, not speaking, listening to the wind hiss through the juniper below. None of them went down to check. In the morning, Vance walked under the trestle in full daylight with 4 other men, all of them carrying lanterns and tools. They found nothing. The ground was smooth. The juniper was undisturbed. But near the center support beam, someone found a second set of marks in the dirt, shallow, parallel lines, like something had been dragged through the dust. The marks were fresh. They hadn't been there the day before. Vance knelt beside them and ran his finger along one of the lines. The dirt was still loose, still soft, as though it had been disturbed only hours before. No one could say what had made them, and no one wanted to guess. On the 3rd day, a tie setter named Mackie was walking the grade alone just after dawn when he heard a sound coming from the direction of the trestle. He stopped and listened. It was a 2-note sound, low and clear, repeated twice, short, then long. It sounded like a whistle, the kind a man might use to call a dog. Mackie turned and looked toward the cut, but he couldn't see anyone. The sound came again, closer this time, and Mackie felt his stomach tighten. He walked fast back to the bunk car, his breath coming hard, and told the others. 3 men went back with him, Vance, Rye, and a rail hand named Tolliver. By the time they reached the cut, the sound had stopped. They stood there in silence for a long time, listening, but heard nothing except the wind starting to pick up off the ridges. Rye walked the full length of the cut, then came back and stood with the others. "Which direction?" he asked Mackie. Mackie pointed toward the trestle. "From there," he said, but it sounded like it was moving. Rye looked at the trestle for a long time, then turned and walked back without saying anything more. That same morning, Farr went through Kodiak's things, a wool blanket the dog slept on, a leather lead, a worn harness with brass fittings that had been oiled and mended more than once. He folded them carefully and placed them in a crate under his bunk. One of the men, a cook's helper named Stroud, asked him what he was going to do. Farr didn't answer. He just closed the crate and slid it back under the bunk, then sat down on the edge of his mattress and stared at the floor. The older hands in Wyoming had already started telling the younger ones the same thing Rye had said that first morning. You don't walk the cut alone anymore, not before sunrise, not after dark, not ever. It wasn't a rule anyone had written down. It didn't need to be. By the end of that third day, every man on the crew knew it, and every man on the crew followed it without question. By the fourth day, the search had become something else. Not a hunt for a living animal anymore, but a ritual of marking and checking, a way for the crew to convince themselves they were still doing something that made sense. They had walked every inch of ground within a mile of the cut. They had dragged hooks through the shallow water of the creek bed. They had climbed the trestle supports and checked every beam, every crosstie, every gap wide enough to hide a body. They had found nothing. The snow remained smooth and unbroken beyond the point where Kodiak's prints ended, and the ground under the trestle stayed packed and empty, no matter how many times they searched it. Men started speaking in lower voices when they passed the cut, and at night in the bunk car, conversations would stop mid-sentence when someone mentioned the dog's name. On the morning of the fifth day, Farr opened the crate under his bunk to put away a spare pair of gloves, and he stopped. Lying on top of the folded wool blanket, Kodiak's blanket, the one Farr had packed away 3 days before, was a strip of leather. Farr pulled it out slowly and held it up to the light coming through the bunk car window. It was a piece of Kodiak's collar, maybe 2 inches long, with one brass rivet still attached. The leather was worn smooth on one side, darkened by years of wear, unmistakable. Farr stared at it for a long time without moving. Then he called Rye over. Rye looked at the strip of leather, then at the crate, then at Farr. "You sure you packed that collar away?" Rye asked. Farr nodded. "Wrapped it in a rag," he said. "Put it in my coat pocket, it's still there." He reached into his coat, which was hanging on a peg beside his bunk, and pulled out the rag. He unwrapped it carefully. The collar was inside, complete, buckle fastened, exactly as he had wrapped it. Rye reached for the strip of leather in Farr's other hand and held it up beside the collar. The leather matched. The brass rivet matched. But the collar showed no tear, no gap, no place where a piece might have come free. They stood there in silence for a long time. Finally, Rye wrapped the collar again and handed it back to Farr. "Don't tell the others," he said. Farr nodded, but by noon every man on the crew knew anyway. The way news travels in a small camp where men work elbow to elbow and sleep within arm's reach of one another. Nobody said much about it out loud, but that night in the bunk car, 3 men asked to be moved to a different crew up line. The foreman denied the requests. There was no other crew. The work had to be finished. That same afternoon, a rail hand named Tolliver was tying a strip of rag to a fence post maybe a quarter mile south of the cut when he found something in the snow near the base of the post. It was a piece of paper, folded twice, tucked under a stone. Tolliver picked it up and unfolded it carefully. The paper was dry, clean, unmarked by weather. Written on it in pencil, in careful block letters, were 4 words: "Check the north beam." Tolliver stood there staring at the note for a long time, then walked back to camp and showed it to Rye. Rye looked at the handwriting, then looked at Tolliver. "Whose hand is that?" he asked. Tolliver shook his head. "I don't know," he said. Rye took the note and walked to the bunk car. He found Farr sitting on his bunk, staring at nothing. Rye handed him the note without saying anything. Farr looked at it, and his face went pale. "That's mine," he said. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "That's my hand." Rye asked him when he had written it. Farr shook his head. "I didn't," he said. "I've never written that. I don't know what it means." Rye turned the paper over, checked both sides, held it up to the light. The paper was clean, recent, the pencil marks still sharp. He asked Farr if he kept a notebook, if he might have written something and forgotten. Farr pulled a small ledger from under his bunk and opened it. The handwriting inside matched the note exactly. The same slant, the same blocky capitals, the same way the letter K leaned slightly to the right. Farr flipped through the pages, checking every entry. There was nothing about a north beam, nothing about checking anything. The last entry was from 3 days before, a routine note about timber counts. Rye folded the note carefully and put it in his own pocket. "We'll check the beam," he said. 4 men went to the trestle that afternoon. Rye, Vance, Mackey, and a man named Cossett. They brought lanterns and tools and climbed down into the ravine, working their way to the north support beam, the one closest to the scrubland side. The beam was solid, Old-growth pine, 12 inches square, sunk deep into the frozen ground. They checked it top to bottom, running their hands over the surface, looking for marks, for cracks, for anything that might explain the note. They found nothing. Vance climbed up onto the beam itself, bracing himself against the deck supports, and checked the underside where it met the cross ties. Still nothing. They were about to give up when Cosette, who had been kneeling in the dirt near the base of the beam, called the others over. There were marks in the dirt there, half hidden by shadow, the same shallow parallel lines they had found near the center beam days before, but these were deeper, longer, and they ran in a curve around the base of the north beam as though something had been dragged in a circle. Cosette brushed the dirt carefully with his hand, following the curve. The lines went all the way around the beam, a complete circle, and where the circle closed there was a small depression in the dirt, maybe 6 inches across, smooth-bottomed and empty. Rye knelt beside the depression and reached into it slowly. His fingers touched something cold and smooth. He pulled it out and held it up to the light. It was a brass rivet, identical to the ones on Kodiak's collar. He turned it over in his hand, checking both sides. It was clean, polished, as though it had just been set. He looked at the other men. Nobody spoke. Vance reached down and felt along the edge of the depression, then pulled his hand back fast. "It's warm," he said. The others stared at him. Vance knelt again and held his hand just above the surface of the depression without touching it. "Feel it," he said. Mackie knelt beside him and held his own hand over the dirt. After a moment, he nodded. "He's right," he said. "It's warm, like something's been sitting there." They stood up slowly, all 4 of them, and backed away from the beam. Nobody suggested digging deeper. Nobody wanted to. That evening, the crew gathered in the cook car for the first time since the search had begun. The foreman, a man named Haverhill who had been upline overseeing timber delivery, had come back to the camp that afternoon and heard the whole story from Rye. He stood at the front of the car and listened in silence as the men talked over one another, voices rising, everyone trying to explain what didn't make sense. Some said Farr must have written the note and forgotten. Others said someone was playing a cruel joke. A few whispered that the land itself was wrong, that something about the country past milepost 40 had always been wrong, that the old-timers who worked that grade in the 90s had stories about it too, stories nobody liked to repeat. Haverhill let them talk for a while, then raised his hand. The room went quiet. "We finished the timber haul," he said. 2 more weeks, maybe 3. After that, we pull the spur and move on. Until then, nobody works alone. Nobody walks the cut after dark, and nobody goes under that trestle unless there are 4 men in full daylight." He looked around the room. "Are we clear?" The men nodded. Haverhill turned and left without saying anything more. That night, Farr sat on his bunk with the collar in one hand and the strip of leather in the other, trying to make them fit together. They didn't. The collar was whole. The strip had come from nowhere. He wrapped them both in the rag again and put them back in his coat pocket, then lay down and stared at the underside of the bunk above him. He didn't sleep. Across the car, Vance lay awake too, listening to the wind hiss through the gaps in the walls. He kept thinking about the warmth in the dirt under the north beam, the way it had felt like breath against his palm. Somewhere outside, far off toward the trestle, he heard a sound. Low, clear, 2 notes. He sat up fast, listening. The sound didn't come again. He lay back down and pulled his blanket up to his chin, but he didn't close his eyes for a long time. By the end of that week, men in Wyoming had stopped asking what had happened to the dog. They had moved on to a different question, one nobody wanted to say out loud. What was still happening, and when would it stop? The older hands told the younger ones the rules again, slower this time, making sure they understood. You don't walk the cut alone. You don't answer if you hear that whistle. You don't touch anything you find near the trestle barehanded. And if you see a light moving under the deck after dark, you turn around and walk the other way without looking back. It wasn't superstition. It was survival. People around the Medicine Bow camp still remember those rules even now. even the ones who never worked that grade themselves. They remember because the rules never went away. The timber haul finished on March 14th, 17 days after Kodiak disappeared. The crew pulled the last load through just after noon, and by evening they had started breaking down the temporary spur, pulling spikes, stacking ties, loading everything onto flat cars bound for the next job upline. The work went fast. Nobody wanted to stay near milepost 40 any longer than necessary. By the second day, the spur was gone, reduced to scattered ballast and the dark rectangular scars in the snow where the ties had rested. The trestle stayed. It was permanent grade, part of the main line, but the crew moved on without looking back. Farr went with them. He carried the collar and the strip of leather in his coat pocket for the rest of that season, and men who worked alongside him later said he never spoke about the dog again. Not once. Not even when someone asked directly. But the story didn't leave with the crew. It stayed in the country around the Medicine Bow Range, passed from one camp to another, from rail hands to homesteaders to the few families who lived in that stretch of Wyoming scrubland. By summer, people were calling it the lost dog of milepost 40, and by the following winter, the details had hardened into something close to ritual. Workers on the main line knew not to walk that section of track alone before sunrise. Maintenance crews refused to inspect the trestle unless there were at least 3 men present, and even then, they wouldn't go under the deck after the sun started to drop. The rules that had started in Farr's crew spread outward, carried by men who moved from job to job, camp to camp, and within a year, those rules had become common knowledge all along the Medicine Bow grade. In 1925, a section foreman named Harlan Cross was walking the line near milepost 40 just after dawn when he saw something lying on the rail. He stopped and looked at it from a distance, then walked closer. It was a dog collar, leather and brass, buckle fastened, laid flat across the iron. Cross didn't touch it. He marked the spot with a chalk line on the rail and reported it when he got back to camp. 2 men went out to check, and by the time they arrived, the collar was gone. The chalk line was still there. The rail was still cold, but the collar had vanished. Cross transferred to a different section 3 weeks later and never came back. In 1929, a young rail hand from Cheyenne named Paul Linden was assigned to a track crew working that same stretch of grade. It was his first job with Union Pacific, and nobody had told him about milepost 40. On his 3rd night, he walked out alone to check a signal lamp that had been reported flickering. He passed the trestle just after 10, and as he walked beneath it, he heard a sound. 2 notes, low and clear, coming from somewhere in the dark. He stopped and called out, thinking maybe another worker was nearby. Nobody answered. The sound came again, closer this time, and Linden felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He turned and walked fast back to camp, and when he got there, an older hand named Stroud took one look at his face and asked where he'd been. Linden told him. Stroud went pale. "You don't walk that stretch alone," he said. "Not ever. Didn't anybody tell you?" Linden shook his head. Stroud told him the story that night, all of it, and Linden requested a transfer the next morning. The foreman denied it. "You'll be fine," he said. "Just follow the rules." By the 1930s, the rules had become part of the training for any crew working the Medicine Bow section. New men learned them in their first week. 2 men minimum past milepost 40, never 1. No inspections after dark. No stopping near the trestle if you hear anything that sounds like a whistle or a dog. And if you find something on the rail, anything at all, you mark it and report it, but you don't touch it barehanded. The rules weren't written down in any official manual, but every foreman knew them, and every foreman passed them on. Men who broke the rules didn't last long. Some of them quit. Some of them were transferred. A few of them just stopped showing up for work and never said why. In 1934, a track inspector named Orville Dane was sent out to survey the trestle for a routine maintenance report. He brought 2 men with him, both experienced, both familiar with the area. They arrived just after sunrise and spent the morning checking the deck supports, the cross ties, the condition of the rail. Everything was solid. The trestle had weathered 11 winters since Kodiak disappeared, and it showed no signs of weakness. But when Dane climbed down into the ravine to check the north beam, the one Rye and the others had inspected back in 1923, he found something that made him stop. There were marks in the dirt at the base of the beam, the same shallow parallel lines, curved in a circle just as they had been before. Dane knelt and brushed the dirt with his hand, following the curve. The lines went all the way around, and where the circle closed, there was a small depression, smooth-bottomed and empty. Dane reached into the depression slowly, and his fingers touched something cold and smooth. He pulled out a brass rivet. He turned it over in his hand, and his stomach tightened. The rivet was clean, polished, as though it had been placed there hours before, not years. He wrapped it in a handkerchief, put it in his pocket, and climbed back up without saying anything to the other men. That night, back in camp, he unwrapped the rivet and looked at it under lamplight. It was identical to the one Rye had found in 1923. Dane put it in a small wooden box and locked it in his trunk. 3 weeks later, the box was empty. The rivet was gone. Dane never found it again. Over the years, other things appeared and disappeared near the trestle. A strip of leather, a worn harness buckle, a piece of folded paper with 4 words written in block letters, "Check the north beam." Always the same words. Always the same handwriting. Men found these things in different places. On the rail, under the deck, tucked into gaps between cross ties. But they always appeared in the early morning just after dawn, and they were always gone by noon. Nobody kept them. Nobody wanted to. The few men who tried found that the objects vanished from locked trunks, from sealed boxes, from coat pockets that had been checked and double-checked. The objects didn't want to be kept. They wanted to be found. By the 1940s, the story had spread beyond the railroad camps. Families who lived near the Medicine Bow Range told their children not to play near the tracks past milepost 40, and mothers who sent their sons to work on the grade made them promise to follow the rules. The trestle became a landmark, the kind of place people pointed to but didn't linger near. Travelers on the main line looked out the windows as the train passed over it, and some of them swore they saw a light moving beneath the deck, low and steady, even in full daylight. Engineers knew not to stop near the trestle if they could help it, and if a train had to halt there for a signal or a track obstruction, the crew stayed inside the cab and didn't look out toward the ravine. Leland Farr died in 1947 in a rail camp outside Rawlins, 60 miles from milepost 40. He was 66 years old. He had worked Union Pacific grade for 43 years, and he had never spoken publicly about what happened to Kodiak. But in the box under his bunk, the one he had carried from camp to camp for more than 2 decades, men found the collar and the strip of leather, both wrapped in the same clean rag he had used in 1923. The collar was whole. The strip of leather still didn't match. The 2 objects lay side by side, impossible and real, and nobody knew what to do with them. Farr's daughter, Margaret, came to collect his things. She looked at the collar and the leather strip for a long time, then wrapped them again and took them home to Cheyenne. She kept them in a drawer for the rest of her life, and when she died in 1969, her sons found them and buried them with her. The collar has never appeared again, but the rivet still does once every few years, always in the same place, always clean and polished, always gone by the time someone comes back to check. People in Wyoming still follow the rules. Maintenance crews working the Medicine Bow section still walk in pairs past milepost 40, still refuse to inspect the trestle after dark, still report anything they find on the rail without touching it. The rules have lasted longer than the men who made them, longer than the camps and the work trains and the crews that pulled the temporary spur in 1923. The rules have lasted because they work, because the alternative is something nobody in Wyoming wants to name out loud. Some say Kodiak got turned around in the snow and wandered off to die somewhere out in the scrubland, and the crew just missed the body in their search. Others say a wolf or a cat took him, dragged him off before anyone saw, and the strange details were just coincidence, just the kind of thing that happens when men work too long in cold country with too little sleep. But the people who live near the Medicine Bow Range, the ones who have heard the 2-note whistle at dawn or seen the light moving under the trestle deck, they don't argue about wolves or cold or coincidence. They just follow the rules, and they teach their children to do the same. Which version makes sense here? The natural one, the human one, or the impossible one nobody in Wyoming dares to say out loud? What detail in this story should not exist in a normal world? And why does a dog's collar stay warm on frozen iron when there is no heat, no fire, no breath left to give? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.